The absence that shaped a nation. Imagine walking down a quiet American street. Wide asphalt, trimmed lawns, parked cars lining the curb. Now look closer. There is no sidewalk. No space designed for walking. No path for children. No margin for the elderly. Only road. This is not an accident. It is not neglect. And it is not a coincidence. The absence of sidewalks across vast parts of the United States is the result of deliberate choices made by planners, engineers, lawmakers, and developers over more than a century. Choices that quietly reshaped how Americans move, live, socialize, and even think about distance. To understand why so many American streets were never meant for walking, we need to go back to a time before the automobile ruled the road.
Streets before cars. In the early 19th century, American streets looked nothing like they do today. They were not primarily for vehicles, because vehicles, as we know them, did not yet exist. Streets were shared spaces. People walked in the road, children played there, vendors sold goods, horses, carts, pedestrians, and social life all mixed together. In colonial towns and early American cities, the concept of a sidewalk was rare. But importantly, this was not because walking was ignored. It was because the entire street belonged to people. Walking did not require special infrastructure. The street itself was the infrastructure. 2. The sidewalk was an urban invention. Sidewalks did not emerge for comfort. They emerged for control. As cities grew denser in the 1800s, streets became chaotic. Horse traffic increased. Carts moved faster. Commercial activity intensified. Urban leaders responded by separating movement. Sidewalks were introduced as a tool to organize pedestrian flow, protect walkers from vehicles, impose order on crowded streets. But the solution was urban-specific. Sidewalks were seen as a necessity of density, not of everyday life. In other words, if your city was crowded, you needed sidewalks. If it wasn't, you didn't. That assumption would echo for generations. 3. America's unique relationship with space. Unlike Europe, the United States developed with extraordinary amounts of land. Distance was not a problem, it was an asset. As cities expanded outward, density dropped. Homes became detached, lots became larger, roads became wider. In these low-density environments, planners believed sidewalks were unnecessary. Why build pedestrian infrastructure when destinations were far apart and land was abundant? Walking was no longer considered a primary mode of transportation. It became something you did inside neighborhoods, not between them. And that distinction mattered. 4. The automobile changes everything. When the automobile entered American life in the early 20th century, it didn't just change transportation, it changed priorities. Cars promised speed, freedom, independence, economic growth. Streets were reimagined as conduits for movement, not places for life. Engineers widened roads, design speeds increased, intersections expanded, pedestrians became an obstacle, and sidewalks, once a symbol of urban order, were now seen as optional extras, especially outside city centers. 5. The suburban experiment begins. After World War II, the United States launched the largest suburban expansion in human history. Millions of homes, miles of new roads, entire communities built from scratch. This was a blank slate moment. And when planners looked at these new suburbs, they asked a simple question. Who is this for? The answer was clear. These neighborhoods were designed for families with cars, commuters, homeowners, not pedestrians. Sidewalks were not banned. They were simply not required. And when budgets were tight, sidewalks were one of the first things to disappear. 6. The cost logic behind missing sidewalks. Sidewalks cost money, not just to build, but to maintain, repair, snow clear, insure. Developers learned quickly that eliminating sidewalks reduced upfront construction costs, lowered long-term maintenance obligations, increased lot sizes, appealed to car-oriented buyers. Local governments often agreed. If a street was residential only and traffic was expected to be light, sidewalks were considered unnecessary infrastructure. Over time, this logic hardened into policy. 7. When optional became normal. By the 1950s and 1960s, something subtle happened. The absence of sidewalks stopped being a design decision and became an assumption. Entire generations grew up believing walking happens in parks, not streets.
Roads are for cars. Sidewalks are an urban feature, not a suburban one. This mindset shaped zoning codes, street standards, and engineering manuals, and once embedded, it was difficult to reverse. 8. What this absence quietly changed. The lack of sidewalks didn't just affect walking, it reshaped social interaction, child independence, public health, accessibility, who felt welcome in public space. But these consequences were not immediate. They unfolded slowly, quietly, often unnoticed. And that is why sidewalks matter most when they are missing.
Engineering rules that quietly removed pedestrians. 1. When streets became engineering problems. By the mid-20th century, American streets were no longer designed by town builders or civic leaders. They were designed by engineers. This shift mattered. Engineers are trained to solve problems that can be measured. Speed, capacity, efficiency, safety as defined by vehicle flow. Walking, by contrast, is difficult to quantify. Pedestrians move unpredictably. They stop. They linger. They cross at unscheduled points. From an engineering perspective, pedestrians introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was something modern street design aimed to eliminate. 2. The rise of the road manual. In 1931, a quiet but powerful document emerged, the first edition of what would later become known as the Highway Design Manual. Over time, similar manuals spread across states and municipalities. These documents did not tell cities what kind of communities to build. They told them how to design roads. And roads were framed as technical systems, not social spaces. Sidewalks were addressed, but often as optional elements, context-dependent features, secondary considerations. In low-density areas, the manuals suggested sidewalks were unnecessary unless pedestrian traffic was anticipated. The assumption was simple. If planners didn't expect people to walk, they didn't need to design for them. This assumption became self-fulfilling. 3. Design speed, a silent priority. One of the most influential concepts in American road design is design speed. Design speed determines lane width, curve radius, sight distance, intersection geometry. Higher speeds require wider lanes, gentler curves, more space. Every one of these elements pushes pedestrians farther from the roadway or removes them entirely. In suburban environments, design speeds were set high, even on residential collectors. Why? Because streets were assumed to serve cars first. Once a street is designed for speed, sidewalks become a liability. Closer pedestrians increase perceived risk. Narrower right-of-way reduces vehicle comfort. Slower movement conflicts with traffic flow goals. So sidewalks were quietly removed, not out of hostility, but out of optimization. 4. Zoning codes and the separation of uses. At the same time, zoning laws were transforming American cities. Residential, commercial, and industrial activities were separated, often by large distances. This separation reduced the need to walk. If schools, stores, and workplaces were miles apart, walking no longer made sense. Planners reasoned, why build sidewalks if no one is expected to walk to their destination? Instead of designing streets to encourage walking, cities designed land use to discourage it. Sidewalks became redundant infrastructure in a system optimized for driving. 5. The subdivision template. By the 1950s, suburban development had become standardized. Developers relied on templates, loop roads, cul-de-sacs, collectors feeding arterials. These designs minimized through traffic and maximized quiet residential environments. But they also increased distances, reduced connectivity, eliminated direct pedestrian roads. Sidewalks, when included, often went nowhere. They ended abruptly, stopped at subdivision borders, disconnected from destinations. Over time, developers realized something uncomfortable. Disconnected sidewalks were worse than no sidewalks at all. So many chose the simpler option, removal. 6. Liability, safety, and legal fear. Another quiet factor was liability. Municipalities worried about trip and fall lawsuits, maintenance responsibility, uneven pavement claims. If a sidewalk cracked, the city could be sued. If there was no sidewalk, responsibility shifted to the individual. This legal logic favored absence over provision. Ironically, roads designed without sidewalks often became more dangerous for pedestrians. But legal frameworks focused on infrastructure responsibility, not systemic risk. 7. The feedback loop of assumptions. Once sidewalks disappeared, pedestrian activity declined. Once pedestrian activity declined, planners recorded low demand. Low demand justified continued absence. This feedback loop reinforced itself for decades. Engineering data showed few pedestrians, minimal walking trips, low sidewalk usage. What the data did not show was suppressed demand. People weren't walking because it was unsafe or uncomfortable, not because they didn't want to. But the system had no way to measure that absence. 8. How standards became culture. Over time, engineering standards stopped feeling like rules. They became culture. Young planners were trained within them. City councils deferred to them. Developers built around them. Streets without sidewalks no longer raised questions. They looked normal.
and when something looks normal long enough, it stops being noticed.
Who sidewalks were really for? 1. Infrastructure is never neutral. Sidewalks are often discussed as technical features, a strip of concrete beside a road. But infrastructure is never neutral. It reflects values, it reveals priorities, and it quietly signals who belongs in the space and who does not. In the United States, the uneven presence of sidewalks tells a story not just about transportation, but about power, race, and class. 2. Walking and social perception. In mid-20th century America, walking began to carry social meaning. Who walked and why mattered. In many suburban communities, homeowners drove, workers commuted by car, children were chauffeured. Walking became associated with poverty, lack of access to vehicles, service labor, domestic work. Sidewalks, once symbols of civic order, were now linked, subtly but powerfully, to people who did not own cars. This perception shaped decisions. Neighborhoods designed for respectable middle-class families did not want to appear walk-dependent, and the absence of sidewalks helped reinforce that image. 3. Redlining and investment patterns. Federal housing policies in the 1930s and 1940s reshaped American cities. Neighborhoods were graded for investment risk. Areas marked as undesirable, often based on race and ethnicity, received fewer public resources. Sidewalks, lighting, drainage, and maintenance followed these patterns. In many cases, urban minority neighborhoods had sidewalks, but poor maintenance. Suburban white neighborhoods had newer roads, but fewer pedestrian facilities. This wasn't accidental. Sidewalks implied public presence. They encouraged movement through neighborhoods. For exclusionary suburbs, limiting pedestrian access was seen as a form of protection. 4. Sidewalks as boundaries. Sidewalks do more than facilitate walking. They create permeability. They allow strangers to pass through, children to explore, residents to encounter one another. In communities seeking social homogeneity, this permeability was seen as a risk. Designing streets without sidewalks reduced casual foot traffic, external visibility, informal gathering. In effect, the street became a semi-private space, accessible primarily by car, and cars are easier to control than people on foot. 5. Class, convenience, and distance. Wealthier communities could afford distance. Large lots, long driveways, private yards. Walking was unnecessary because everything important happened indoors or behind a windshield. In lower-income areas, walking was unavoidable. Sidewalks became concentrated where walking was a necessity, not a choice. This reinforced a cultural divide. Walking as need versus walking as leisure. Sidewalks as utility versus sidewalks as amenity. Suburbs optimized for leisure did not see sidewalks as essential infrastructure. 6. Policing, surveillance, and movement. The presence or absence of sidewalks also shaped policing. Sidewalks legitimize movement. Without them, anyone walking along a road appears out of place. This dynamic affected teenagers, service workers, people of color, non-residents. Walking in a sidewalk-free neighborhood could trigger suspicion. In this way, the lack of sidewalks functioned as a subtle gatekeeping tool. Movement without a car became socially and legally ambiguous. 7. The quiet normalization of exclusion. None of this required explicit policy language. No law said, "Do not build sidewalks to exclude." Instead, exclusion was achieved through zoning, road standards, funding priorities, cultural assumptions. Sidewalks were simply not provided. And absence is harder to challenge than presence. There was no protest against something that was never promised. 7. The quiet normalization of exclusion. None of this required explicit policy language. No law said, "Do not build sidewalks to exclude." Instead, exclusion was achieved through zoning, road standards, funding priorities, cultural assumptions. Sidewalks were simply not provided. And absence is harder to challenge than presence. There was no protest against something that was never promised. 7. The quiet normalization of exclusion. None of this required explicit policy language. No law said, "Do not build sidewalks to exclude." Instead, exclusion was achieved through zoning, road standards, funding priorities, cultural assumptions. Sidewalks were simply not provided. And absence is harder to challenge than presence. There was no protest against something that was never promised. 7. The quiet normalization of exclusion. None of this required explicit policy language. No law said,
do not build sidewalks to exclude. Instead, exclusion was achieved through zoning, road standards, funding priorities, cultural assumptions. Sidewalks were simply not provided. And absence is harder to challenge than presence. There was no protest against something that was never promised. 7. The quiet normalization of exclusion.
The hidden cost to everyday life. 1. Walking became risky. For most of human history, walking was the safest way to move. But on many American streets, walking slowly became the most dangerous. Without sidewalks, pedestrians were forced into the roadway or onto narrow shoulders. Cars passed inches away, noise replaced conversation, speed replaced caution. The street sent a clear message: you are not the priority here. Over time, this message shaped behavior. People didn't just walk less because it was inconvenient, they walked less because it felt unsafe. 2. Children and the loss of independence. One of the earliest and most profound impacts of sidewalk-free streets was on children. In earlier generations, children walked to school, played in front of their homes, visited friends on foot. Sidewalks made these movements possible and socially acceptable. Without them, parents faced a dilemma. Let children walk in the street or drive them everywhere? Most chose the latter. As a result, children's independent mobility declined, outdoor play decreased, reliance on adults increased. This shift altered childhood itself. 3. Health consequences hidden in plain sight. The decline in walking had health implications. But these consequences emerged slowly, making them easy to ignore. Reduced daily movement contributed to higher obesity rates, cardiovascular issues, reduced mental well-being. Public health discussions often focused on diet and exercise programs. Rarely did they question the design of the streets themselves. Yet for many Americans, the street environment removed walking as a practical option long before personal choices were made. 4. Aging in a car-dependent landscape. Sidewalk absence also affected aging populations. As people grew older, driving became harder, reaction times slowed, vision declined. In neighborhoods without sidewalks, aging residents faced isolation. Simple activities, walking to a mailbox, visiting a neighbor, getting fresh air, became risky or impossible. Communities designed for young drivers did not adapt as residents aged. The built environment stayed frozen while human needs changed. 5. Safety statistics and misleading conclusions. Traffic safety data often showed fewer pedestrian injuries in suburban areas, lower recorded foot traffic. This was interpreted as success. But it ignored a key factor. People weren't walking. Risk was reduced by elimination, not by protection. This logic masked systemic danger. Instead of asking why pedestrians were absent, planners celebrated low pedestrian counts. The absence of sidewalks disappeared into the data. 6. The social cost of isolation. Sidewalks are not just for movement. They are places of interaction. Brief conversations, eye contact, familiar faces. Without sidewalks, neighbors passed each other in cars. Spontaneous interaction declined. Social trust weakened. Communities became quieter, but not necessarily closer. Public life retreated into private space. 7. Accessibility and invisible exclusion. For people with disabilities, sidewalk-free streets created barriers. Wheelchairs, walkers, and strollers require stable, predictable surfaces. Without sidewalks, mobility was restricted, independence was reduced. Public participation declined. Accessibility laws addressed buildings. They rarely addressed the street between them. And without that connection, access remained incomplete. 8. A design that shaped behavior. None of these outcomes were intended, but they were predictable. When a system is designed for cars, human movement becomes a secondary consideration. Behavior follows design. People adapted, not because they wanted to, but because they had no alternative.
Why some places chose a different path. 1. The sidewalk map is not random. If you look closely at the American landscape, sidewalks do exist. They are just unevenly distributed. Older neighborhoods, pre-war cities, streetcar suburbs, college towns, dense coastal metros. These places followed a different logic, one rooted in human movement before automobile dominance. Their sidewalks are not retrofits. They are remnants. 2. Cities built before the car. In cities developed before widespread car ownership, walking was assumed. Distances were short, blocks were compact, streets were narrow. Sidewalks were not amenities, they were necessities. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago. Even when cars arrived, sidewalks remained embedded in the urban fabric. Removing them would have been unthinkable. 3. Streetcar suburbs and the walking radius. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, streetcars expanded cities outward. But unlike post-war suburbs, streetcar suburbs were designed around walking. Homes were placed within a short radius of transit stops. Sidewalks connected houses to stations, shops, and schools. These neighborhoods balanced moderate density, walkability, access to transit. They represent a forgotten middle ground in American planning. 4. Why some suburbs kept sidewalks. Not all suburbs abandoned sidewalks. Some municipalities made conscious choices. Often this happened when communities valued public life. Planners resisted highway-style standards. Residents demanded walkability. Local codes required pedestrian infrastructure. In these areas, sidewalks signaled civic investment, community identity, long-term value. They were seen not as costs, but as assets. 5. Climate, culture, and geography. Climate also played a role. In temperate regions, walking was comfortable year-round. Outdoor life was more visible. In harsh climates, sidewalks required more maintenance. Snow removal, heat exposure, ice damage. Some cities invested in sidewalks anyway. Others used climate as justification to avoid them. The difference was not weather, it was priority. 6. College towns and pedestrian demand. College towns are among the most walkable places in the U.S. Why? Because walking is unavoidable. Students move between housing, classrooms, libraries, social spaces. Sidewalks in these towns were preserved or expanded out of necessity. They demonstrate a critical truth. When people must walk, infrastructure follows. 7. What these exceptions reveal. Places with sidewalks share common traits: shorter blocks, mixed land uses, slower traffic, visible public life. These environments feel different. Not louder, not chaotic, more human. They reveal that sidewalk absence was not inevitable. It was a choice. 8. The missed opportunity. As post-war suburbs expanded, the lessons of older places were ignored. Efficiency replaced experience. Speed replaced connection. And the sidewalk, simple, unremarkable, essential, was left behind.
The economics of not walking. 1. Sidewalks and the price of land. For decades, sidewalks were viewed as a cost, not an investment. Every foot of concrete required materials, labor, right-of-way, long-term maintenance. In low-density developments, this cost was multiplied across miles of road. Developers made a calculation. If buyers were expected to drive everywhere, sidewalks would not increase sales, so they were removed. This decision lowered initial costs and maximized lot size, a key selling point in suburban real estate. 2. The hidden subsidy of car infrastructure. While sidewalks were scrutinized for cost, roads and parking were not. Streets, highways, and parking lots were heavily subsidized by federal funding, state transportation budgets, fuel taxes, municipal bonds. The economic system favored driving. Sidewalks, by contrast, were often funded locally. This imbalance made pedestrian infrastructure appear expensive, even though car infrastructure cost far more. 3. Property values and perception. For much of the 20th century, walkability was not a selling point. Privacy was. Distance signaled exclusivity. Quiet streets implied safety. Limited access implied status. Sidewalks suggested movement.
movements suggested outsiders. In some markets, the absence of sidewalks was framed as a feature, not a flaw. 4. Retail, parking, and consumption. Commercial development followed the same logic. Shopping centers were designed for cars. Parking capacity mattered more than foot traffic. Stores were spaced far apart, connected by asphalt instead of sidewalks. Walking between destinations was inconvenient by design. Consumption was optimized for speed, not experience. 5. The economic cost of distance. Over time, the cost of this model became visible. Households in car-dependent areas spent more on vehicle ownership, fuel, insurance, maintenance. Transportation became the second largest household expense after housing. Sidewalk-free design locked families into this cost structure. Walking was not just discouraged, it was economically irrelevant. 6. A shift in market signals. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, something changed. Preferences shifted. Younger generations valued proximity, flexibility, walkable environments. Real estate markets responded. Walkability began to correlate with higher property values, faster appreciation, commercial success. Sidewalks quietly gained economic value. 7. Retrofitting the absence. Cities began to realize what was missing. But retrofitting sidewalks is difficult. Right-of-way is limited, utilities are in the way, costs are high. What was saved in the past now required significant investment to restore. Absence turned out to be expensive. 8. The new economics of walkability. Today, sidewalks are increasingly seen as public health investments, economic development tools, climate resilience measures. But the legacy of past decisions remains. Entire regions were built without them. And changing that requires more than money. It requires rethinking priorities.
Why fixing it is so difficult. 1. Sidewalks as a political issue. Adding sidewalks sounds simple. Pour concrete, connect the street. In reality, it is political. Sidewalks force communities to ask uncomfortable questions. Who is this for? Who pays? Who gains access? For neighborhoods built around privacy and car use, sidewalks can feel like intrusion. They challenge the original promise of separation. 2. The cost debate revisited. When sidewalk projects are proposed, cost resurfaces. Residents ask, why now? Why here? Why not elsewhere? Unlike highways, sidewalks are local projects. There is no distant funding source to absorb the expense. Property owners are often asked to contribute. Support drops quickly. 3. Space constraints and technical limits. Retrofitting sidewalks require space, but many streets were built with narrow rights-of-way, drainage systems at the edge, utility poles and boxes. Adding sidewalks means removing trees, relocating utilities, narrowing lanes, reconfiguring drainage. Each solution creates new opposition. 4. Traffic, speed, and resistance. Sidewalks change how streets feel. They narrow visual space, they slow traffic, they introduce human presence. For drivers accustomed to speed and comfort, this feels like loss. Traffic engineers worry about reduced capacity, congestion, complaints. The system resists change because it was optimized for a different goal. 5. Cultural identity and the car. In the United States, the car is more than transportation. It represents freedom, independence, personal space. Sidewalks challenge this narrative. They suggest shared space. They prioritize collective movement. Resistance to sidewalks is often framed as practicality, but it is deeply cultural. 6. Fear of change. Some opposition is rooted in fear. Fear of increased foot traffic, reduced property values, unfamiliar faces, change in neighborhood character. Sidewalks symbolize openness. For communities built on controlled access, openness feels threatening. 7. The generational divide. Younger residents often support sidewalks. Older residents often resist them. Not because one group is right and the other is wrong, but because they grew up in different systems. Experience shapes expectation. 8. Incremental change, not revolution. Where sidewalks are added, they often appear gradually. Near schools, around transit stops, along commercial corridors. This piecemeal approach reflects compromise. It also reflects the difficulty of reversing decades of design assumptions.
Cities that are relearning how to walk. The quiet reversal. While many American streets remain unchanged, a growing number of cities are doing something unusual. They are going back. Not to nostalgia, not to pre-car romanticism, but to fundamentals. They are re-examining streets not as traffic machines, but as public environments. And sidewalks are often the first signal of that shift. 2. Why the change started in cities. The sidewalk comeback did not begin everywhere at once. It started where pressure was highest. Dense cities, rising housing costs, traffic congestion, public health concerns. In these environments, the limits of car-only design became impossible to ignore. Streets could no longer absorb more vehicles. Parking could no longer expand. Travel time could no longer be solved with widening. Walking returned, not as an ideal, but as a necessity. 3. From expansion to rebalancing. Earlier generations of planning focused on expansion. More lanes, more roads, more parking. Today's sidewalk projects are part of a different mindset. Rebalancing. Cities are reallocating space. Narrowing lanes, reducing curb radii, adding pedestrian buffers, reconnecting broken sidewalks. These changes are often modest in scale, but profound in effect. They alter how a street feels. 4. The role of safety data. One reason sidewalks are returning is data. Crash statistics consistently show lower injury rates on streets with sidewalks, fewer severe accidents where pedestrians are separated, slower vehicle speeds in sidewalk-rich environments. This data reframed sidewalks, not as amenities, but as safety infrastructure. That framing made investment politically defensible. 5. Health, climate, and co-benefits. Sidewalk projects gained momentum by solving multiple problems at once. They support daily physical activity, reduced vehicle dependence, lower emissions, social interaction. Instead of selling sidewalks as nice to have, cities began presenting them as multi-purpose infrastructure. That language mattered. 6. Incremental, not radical. Most sidewalk revivals are incremental. Cities rarely rebuild entire networks at once. They start with school routes, transit corridors, commercial streets, missing connections. These targeted projects create visible success, and visible success builds public support. 7. Resistance still exists. Not every redesign is welcomed. Residents worry about parking loss, traffic changes, construction disruption. But something has shifted. The debate is no longer whether sidewalks belong, but where, how wide, and how fast. That is a fundamentally different conversation. 8. What these cities are proving. Cities adding sidewalks are not becoming less functional. They are becoming more flexible. Streets that support walking, adapt better to demographic change, age more gracefully, respond better to economic shifts. They reveal a truth long ignored. A street that works only for cars works only for a moment.
What the absence of sidewalks says about America. 1. Sidewalks as a cultural mirror. By this point, it becomes clear that sidewalks are not just infrastructure. They are cultural artifacts. Where sidewalks exist, they signal shared public life, tolerance for proximity, acceptance of difference, movement beyond the private sphere. Where they do not, they signal something else. Autonomy, separation, control, distance. The American street, stripped of sidewalks, reflects how the nation has historically understood freedom, not as collective access, but as personal independence. 2. Freedom through distance. In much of the United States, freedom has been defined spatially. More land, more separation, more private space. Sidewalks compress space. They bring people closer together. They encourage chance encounters. They blur boundaries. For a culture that prized distance as safety, sidewalks felt unnecessary, even undesirable. 3. The subtle power of design. Most Americans did not choose sidewalk-free streets. They inherited them. The absence was normalized long before it was questioned. Design shaped behavior quietly. People stopped walking. Streets emptied. Public life retreated. Not because Americans rejected walking, but because the environment made it impractical. The power of design lies precisely in this subtlety. 4. Inequality written in concrete, or the lack of it.
The sidewalk map of the United States still mirrors inequality. Communities with lower incomes, fewer cars, higher pedestrian need, often lack safe walking infrastructure. Meanwhile, places that market walkability as lifestyle often price it at a premium. Sidewalks became unevenly distributed, not by need, but by market logic. 5. The environmental reckoning. Sidewalk-free design locked cities into car dependence. That dependence carried consequences. Higher emissions, increased land consumption, infrastructure sprawl. As climate concerns rise, the absence of basic pedestrian infrastructure looks less like oversight and more like liability. The street, once designed for speed, now struggles to adapt. 6. A question of identity. At its core, the sidewalk debate is about identity. Is the street a corridor for movement or a space for life? Is a neighborhood a collection of private properties or a shared environment? Sidewalks force these questions into the open, and that is why they remain controversial. 7. What Americans are reconsidering. Across the country, attitudes are shifting. Not everywhere. Not uniformly. But the conversation has changed. Walkability is no longer fringe. It is discussed in terms of health, resilience, economic strength, quality of life. The absence of sidewalks is finally being noticed. 8. The street as a choice. American streets look the way they do because of choices. Not inevitability. Not geography. Not fate. Choices made by planners. By engineers. By lawmakers. By markets. And choices can be revisited.
What kind of streets come next? 1. The return of a simple question. After more than a century of design decisions, debates, and assumptions, the question facing American cities today is surprisingly simple. What is a street for? Is it only a conduit for vehicles, or is it a public space that serves everyone who lives along it? Sidewalks bring this question into focus because they cannot be ignored. They physically declare intent. 2. The shift from speed to experience. Across the United States, a quiet shift is underway. Some cities are no longer measuring success only by traffic flow, travel time, vehicle capacity. They are beginning to value safety, comfort, presence, everyday usability. Sidewalks are central to this shift. They slow streets down, not by force, but by design. They remind drivers that streets are inhabited places, not empty corridors. 3. The limits of retroactive change. Not every sidewalk-free street will gain one. Land constraints remain, budgets remain limited, resistance remains real. But the conversation has changed. Sidewalks are no longer dismissed as optional. They are discussed as indicators of accessibility, resilience, long-term value. Even when they cannot be built everywhere, they are now part of the equation. And that matters. 4. A new generation of expectations. Younger Americans are growing up with different assumptions. They expect walkable environments, flexible mobility, public spaces that feel usable, not hostile. This generational shift is already shaping housing demand, urban policy, redevelopment priorities. Sidewalks, once overlooked, are becoming symbols of livability. 5. Sidewalks as civic language. A sidewalk is not loud. It does not announce itself, but it communicates. It says, you are allowed to be here. You belong in this space. You can move at your own pace. That message, simple, quiet, and physical, may be one of the most powerful forms of civic language a city can offer. 6. The future is not uniform. America will not become uniformly walkable, nor should it. Urban, suburban, and rural places will continue to differ.
But difference does not require exclusion. Streets can acknowledge cars without erasing people. Sidewalks represent balance, not opposition. 7. The absence taught us. Looking back, the absence of sidewalks taught America something important. Design decisions last longer than intentions. What seems optional today can define everyday life for generations. And what is left out often matters more than what is added. The reason so many American streets have no sidewalks is not a mystery anymore. It's history. It's policy. It's culture. It's economics. But now it's also a choice. As cities grow, age, and adapt, sidewalks force a fundamental question, not about concrete, but about values. Do streets exist primarily to move us through places as quickly as possible? Or do they exist to support life where it actually happens? That question doesn't have a single answer, and it shouldn't, but it's a conversation worth having. So if you live on a street with no sidewalk, or one that gained one later, how does it change the way you use your neighborhood? And what do you think American streets should prioritize next?